Tolkien in On Fairy Stories, I think, who talks first about this idea that fairy is not the name of the being, that fairy is the place, which is why I often like to refer to fairyland in order to just like establish that.
Because it began as the fairy folk.
The precisely,
folk of fairy.
The fairy folk. And also it's a simple enough thing to think of the English are from England. You know? Fairies are from fairy.
Welcome to our second deep dive video.
Number 2.
Welcome to Finding Folklore, the deep dives, Sprack Jack.
Sprack Jack and the Pixies.
Jack and the Pixies.
Jack and the Pixies.
So this is a video associated with our podcast. If you've
not watched the podcast episode specifically, which is episode 2, it's just called Sprack Jack, isn't it?
It's just called Sprack Jack.
Sprack Jack. Then make sure you head over to your Podmonger, your preferred podcast emporium, and listen to it. It's very, very good.
And then once you've listened to that, hurry back here and just stick this on, and we're going to talk about basically everything that we can think of talking about regarding that story and the sort of associated folklore.
Yeah, if you may have watched, so if you have listened to our first episode, which is the Red King and the White Ship, then you may be familiar with this. The deep dive episode of the YouTube series to accompany that is out after a little technical difficulty and some minor delays. It is out now, though,
and the process will smooth out from here on.
One can but hope.
Touch wood. As we do in the entering the forest.
As we do. Yeah, I mean, I'm quite happy with the video we did for the Red King and the White Ship. I think that's generally the direction we're going to be going with these. But as we accrue audience, do let us know whether you'd like more of one type of thing emphasized or explored more another.
Yeah, we'd like to hear from you if you have suggestions of the ways we can make these videos better, or other things that you'd like to see explored. We'd like to do more videos about other subjects.
The plan is at the moment, while we get our head around it, the videos are explicitly companion pieces for the podcast episodes, but we've got a lot of extra content planned out, including interviews with specialists, with storytellers, with folklorists, and certainly with a lot of the musicians that we've already involved and included and commissioned work from. We'd like to have lovely good long chats with them that we get up on the video, up on the YouTube channel as well. And
then maybe even to just go into depth about specific subjects that are kind of interest and central to the process of what it is that we're doing on this podcast and with the Finding Folklore project kind of at large.
And other stuff, other cultural artifacts. It would be very cool to do an Over the Garden Wall deep dive, for example.
Yeah, I was almost talking about, in fact, we can talk a little bit about, I think it's worth a mention of Over the Garden Wall in this episode.
Is it?
Yeah, because of the witch. I don't know, it's just the voice that you did for the witch. I feel like that was an Over the Garden Wall.
Fine. Okay.
I don't think it's a reach.
It wasn't intentionally an Over the Garden Wall reference.
Well, it's in your subconscious.
It was more just me having a limited number of voices.
No.
Okay,
I don't believe that at all.
I guess we get right into it. I mean, I think... So this episode is fairies, and it's a fairy tale, and it's very much about fairies and pixie lore and everything around that. I don't know Well, I mean, so listening to the story, like hearing you tell it in the booth, I definitely did read it in your book as well, but it feels like it lives so much more for me in the telling, in the performance of it. But it strikes me very much as a sort of like a real classic fairy tale. Of the style that the big ones being like Jack of the Beanstalk, one of the classics. So it's funny. We spoke about this in the podcast a bit, but I mentioned this folktale index.
Yes,
and this folktale motif index. I actually slightly misrepresented it because those are two separate indexes.
Oh, okay.
But both developed by Stith Thompson. So
there are two indexes. One is the fairy tale.
There's two indexes, but the motif index is cross-referenced by the other index. The other index, I refer to it as the Arne Thompson index, which is still how I do refer to it, but that's sort of so. So as I recall, it was first developed in, I think, like 1910 by a Finnish folklorist called something Arne, Antti Arne, I think. That was 1910. Then it was revisited, I think, first in 1928 and then again in the 1960s by the American folklorist Stith Thompson, who translated it into English and further developed it and added and cohered. Then that became the Arne Thompson folktale type index.
Yeah.
And that then cross-referenced and incorporated Stith Thompson's folktale motif index. So they work in tandem together.
The motif one is just from
Thompson, yeah. And the reason I call it specifically the Arne Thompson index is because if you look into it now, then you'll find it's often called the Arne Thompson Uther index or the ATU index. And I'm in two minds as to that. That's because in 2004, a German folklorist called something or other Uther decided he was going to totally redevelop it again,
give it an overhaul,
and I can't really comment on his changes. A lot of his changes I feel were subjective changes. He thought that some elements of it, he thought that some of the descriptions were too vague or not specific enough. But quite subjective. He thought that it focused too much on orally transmitted stories rather than literary stories. But again, I kind of think that's maybe was a strength. Yeah. He also he claims to have added a lot of the main thing that makes me go about the Uther element is just the insane publicity that he's done around it and the extreme pedantic efforts he's made online to edit every single reference to the Arne Thompson index to add in Uther onto the end of it.
Right.
I do not know this, but I'm fairly confident in my opinion, my subjective personal opinion, that he is responsible for a lot of the pedantic, extreme Wikipedia editing to make sure everything refers to the Arne Thompson Uther index. Right. I think there's been he's really, really, really been behind, potentially, I believe, allegedly, an extreme campaign to perhaps even misrepresent how widespread and how accepted his version, his 2004 iteration of the well-established Arne Thompson index is. And without meaning to Stith Thompson was a giant of American folklore.
Yeah, it's putting yourself on a very high pedestal to
I'm just a bit uncomfortable.
Add your name onto the
I'm uncomfortable with the degree to which it feels like it's been promoted for personal career ambitions rather than by Uther himself, rather than by the academic community or the folklorist community as a whole.
As we were speaking about last time, is things being taken by the folk and catching on naturally. Yeah. In the modern information age, there is a way of doing things where it doesn't happen naturally. It is done deliberately.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I'm not wedded to this. This is on a hill I'm going to die on. Do give me your opinion if you are a great fan of Uther and a proponent of ATU over AT. I am more than happy and open to persuasion on this. It's really just the way in which it's been done it's sort of made me instinctually cautious.
I think there's that. From my usual position of ignorance, it sounds like that's something to think about. At least is that because there is it being changed everywhere across the board. It doesn't really allow for dissent.
Yeah.
And opinions can differ.
And often do in this storied field.
But to go back to the index itself.
So to go back to the index itself, and just to go back to the whole notion of folktales, I brought my copy of... so if you're interested in folk tales and fairy tales as a whole, the Catherine Briggs, specifically we're talking about fairies, is sort of one of the go-to authors, academics. This is her 2-volume Dictionary of British Folk Tales in the English Language. As you can see, it's quite hefty. It is, and even then, it's not exhaustive. It's not truly ultimately definitive. It is not comprehensive. It's as comprehensive and exhaustive as I think it is possible for such a project to be, but there's still obviously loads that aren't in there. But this very much is a foundational work in the British context of cohering and classifying and truly researching folk tales and fairy tales. And this Catherine Briggs's A Dictionary of Fairies is an incredibly useful tool for when you're actually getting into fairies themselves. It's presented as an encyclopedia. Yeah, and it's. Well, I don't know if it is. So for quite a long time, this was out of print, and so commanded a really high price because it's a really very useful and comprehensive text. I have this vague feeling, I haven't checked, I have this vague feeling that there might be a new edition, not a revised edition, but a new one that is out.
Subtitled Hobgoblins, Brownies, Bogies, and Other Supernatural Creatures. Yeah,
it's really good. So in fact, actually, I don't know what it says in here, but we had... who did we have in this? It was Pixies.
Yeah, Pixies.
So it's Pixies. Yeah, but I meant, are there any names? I don't think that we'll get... Here we go, Pixies. I don't think that this will have Gran Colin and Tiddy Cole because they're very, very local, very specific. I'll have a quick look. Let's see if it does. But it's definitely got the section on Pixies, which is... No, it doesn't have Cole or Colin... Yeah, she's not that good. Oh, here we go. We've got Colt Pixie. Brilliant. So we do have Colin and Coleman Gray, who is a Cornish pixie boy. But we've got then the Colt Pixie, which are this reference. So here we go. Colt Pixie. This is the Hampshire name for a spirit like the Northern Brag or Dunny. Keatley in fairy mythology quotes a Captain Grose as saying in Hampshire. They give the name of Colt Pixie to a supposed spirit or fairy which in the shape of a horse wickers, i.e. neighs, and misleads horses into bogs, etc. In Somerset, however, the Colt Pixie, again in the form of a colt, is an orchard guardian who chases apple thieves. Ruth Tongue in County Folklore, Volume 8, suggests that he is a form taken by Lazy Lawrence. The Dorset Coal Pixie sounds as if it might be a variant of the same name. Coal Pixie here, it says, Keatley, quoting from Brand's Popular Antiquities, Volume 2, page 513, says, in Dorset, the pixie lore still lingers. The being is called Pexie and Coal Pexie. The fossil Belemnites are named Coal Pexie's fingers, and the fossil Echini, Coal Pexie's heads. The children, when naughty, are also threatened with the Pexie, who is supposed to haunt woods and coppices. Now that's... Thank you, Catherine Briggs, who, by the way, is again a giant in her field. There's no question of her place in history. That's cool and interesting because it connects Colt Pixie or Cold Pixie, which is the term here, with, of course, a pixie being called Cole, Tiddy Cole, and Gran Colin. So it makes their names then clearly. It's indicated there's some derivation of that.
But is Cole connected with Colt? As in the horse.
In this context, it looks like it is. Cole, the Dorset version there was written down as Coal Pixie. Yeah, just dropping the T to make Coal Pixie. And again, this, in terms of what I was saying in the podcast, this demonstrates the deep connection that we had. So here we've got Somerset, Dorset, and Hampshire. All there have Colt Pixies or some variation on them, which shows what I was saying about pixie folklore not just being Cornwall and Devon. Piskie I'm offering as an alternative. Don't get angry. Piskie and pixie, very different things. but it spreads all the way through from Dorset and Somerset into Hampshire. And though there's none here, there are also similar shreds of evidence of pixies in Sussex too, in place names and so on. This is interesting because it references Lazy Lawrence, who we will... I don't know if we'll deal with Lazy Lawrence in particular this season, but there is a specific Lazy Lawrence fairy tale, which is in this very, very, very good book called New Forest Myths and Folklore by one of the great authors of our age and day, Brice Stratford.
Great.
You own a copy of that book, don't you? Yes, you've read that.
Is that not my copy?
Yes,
I think that might be my copy.
This is your copy. But yeah, so in there I talk about this Lazy Lawrence folklore, which again is a local, a properly New Forest piece, but it's that connects it with this idea of orchards, which brings us to this weird, the mellifluous, vague, and ever-changing nature of fairies in general. And pixies in particular.
Yes, so I mean, I think one of the interesting things that struck me when we were doing our little chat in the podcast was Gran Colin being a larger than human size pixie.
Yeah.
And of course, pixies, fairies, these creatures have changed size over their kind of literary lives.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So generally speaking, they are changeable in terms of their size. There's some websites where which is actively collating sightings of fairies, modern ones. So people are supposed to continuously. In fact, I'll find it when we'll find out which it is. We'll get the link up on the description because that's a really cool project. But interestingly, their research chimes with historic accounts, whereby the more pixies or fairies that you see in any one go, in any one sighting, generally the smaller each individually will be. As if they have some total amount of space they can take up and it becomes divided amongst the fairies. Yeah, isn't that weird? I don't know why that'd be. So when you see them, often they're wrestling or dancing when they're in a large group. And when that happens, they're much smaller. Whereas when it's one or two, they'll be much bigger. Sometimes they will be tiny, thumb size. Sometimes they'll be the size of a small child. Gran Colin being that big is very rare. Although there is, I can't remember the details, but I came across some fragment of, I think it was Jersey folklore in the Channel Isles, and there were two fairies rather, who behaved very similarly. As in, one was really big, one was really little. I think they were twins, and they throw a ball to each other from either side of the island, just like in the New Forest. They throw sticks. They throw scoils. I won't go into the definition of a scoil now. So
I think we mentioned it on the podcast. Yeah. Because I really like that idea. Is that if you're hit with a stick, but if you're a New Forester who's out scugging, and you throw a stick,
and someone can sit with it.
And you say, "Oh, it wasn't me. It was Tiddy Cole."
It was Tiddy Cole. It was Gran Colin. It was sorry, not me. It's the fairies. And again, if someone complains to any authorities about that, then just as with again, I don't want to cover the same ground, but just as with this whole idea of using hauntings and superstition to mask smugglers' activities, anyone complaining about that will be dismissed as a silly, superstitious yokel local. Which is quite nice. Yeah, I feel like maybe there was also a similar one to do with playing Hurley. I don't know. I dimly recall, but that idea of these two fairies, one big, one little, who do something over the length of a cohered geographical unit, like an island or the forest. Yeah, that's something that exists elsewhere.
Where in this sort of classification of fairies and pixies and things, are elves synonymous, or are we going into a whole?
Actually, no, we're not
into boggy ground.
We're not going into boggy ground there. Actually, this is really so. I'm hitting you hard and fast with the book recommendations, but this is a really cool and interesting field. A very good, quite recent book, I think this is 2022, is Twilight of the Godlings by Francis Young, Cambridge University Press.
Haven't got around to that one myself.
Very beautiful cover, as you can all see. And this presents quite a revisionist take, but revisionist in a positive and constructive sense, as in it challenges a lot of sacred cows in the field, and it really quite successfully and not before time takes a good critical approach to thoughtlessly held ideas, much as I did when I mentioned this idea of a Celtic fringe survival.
Yeah,
there is this idea that fairies are simply pagan Celtic gods that became fairies, and again, that's one of those things that sounds really obvious and true, but doesn't stand up to closer scrutiny. There are examples, very, very, very limited examples of figures from older mythology becoming fairies, but they're rare. Mab, for example, and there's also the example of Saint Brigid, who does apparently, it seems, descend from an earlier goddess. But this is not the standard. And I mean, really, I won't go into too much detail here. Get this book, read this book. Francis Young really knows what he's talking about. Essentially, what this book talks about is the degree to which fairies, as we have them, British fairies, are this strange amalgam of pre-Anglo-Saxon British belief. So pre-Anglo-Saxon Celtic British belief. Which was heavily influenced by the Roman occupation of Britain. So incorporated a lot of Roman and classical concepts of the supernatural world. In terms of Pan and dryads and naiads and
stuff starting to get into the animism direction,
that kind of thing,
household god kind of feeling.
Well, that's a more interesting one, because
is that different?
That's not at all what I'm saying. Almost the opposite of household gods, really, in terms of nature sprites and beings of the trees, that sort of thing. Partly, the reason I say that is because actually the Anglo-Saxons had quaff gods, quaff goddess. Who essentially were household gods. That's
very different to animism, where things have
And also, there's in some instances there's direct overlap, but that's because of how long ago this is. That's very vague. So it's easy just to say Romano-British stuff, right? So the supernatural beliefs of the Romano-British and sub-Roman period, which was in itself an amalgamation of pre-Roman Brythonic Celtic beliefs and sub and post-Roman beliefs, Roman influence beliefs, right? So you get this weird place. Then the Anglo-Saxon stuff comes in, and the Anglo-Saxon beliefs then meld and merge with those. Cough goddess is one example, but also elves are a big part of that. Then, in the aftermath of the Norman conquest, when for some reason the vast array of names and words that are used to refer to a vast array of creatures shrinks right down, and that's when the word, and for no reason that anyone yet has come up with a good theory for, the word elf remains. Elf remains. Elf survives. And so the word elf comes to be used for many, many, many different things. So that weird amalgam of beliefs from three different cultural backgrounds, the Germanic in the Anglo-Saxon, the Celtic in the pre-Roman Brythonic, and then the classical in the Roman influence, they get melded together. And in the aftermath of the Norman conquest, there's some language change. The word elf becomes the predominant word used, but it becomes to be used to refer to a wide array of different creatures from those different traditions, some of which are composite creatures from more than one of those traditions. And all of that gets melded and shaped together to create this bizarre hodgepodge of beings and creatures and beliefs and traditions, which is the English or the British tradition of fairies moving forward. Interestingly, we then later on, after elf has become so established, we then gradually get the word fairy comes in, and fairy overtakes it. It was Tolkien in On Fairy Stories, I think, who talks first about this idea that fairy is not the name of the being properly, but rather the name of the, I think off the top of my head, I think it's something like the realm or state in which the fairy exists.
Yeah, so, I read this.
So the idea so that fairy is the place, which is why I often like to refer to fairyland in order to just like establish that.
Because it began as the fairy folk.
The precisely.
Folk of fairy.
The fairy folk. And also it's a simple enough thing. We think of the English are from England. Fairies are from fairy.
Yeah,
that makes it kind of makes sense, but that's been forgotten since. The word elfland was also used. Again, just as I have quoted previously, Francis Young, actually, I've quoted him saying this, not in this book, but he talks about this idea that fairies are not an epistemological proposition, they're a lived experience. And that's the key thing to remember. There isn't one cohesive worldview of fairy or fairies, or fairyland or fairy folk. This overlap between elves and fairies is an interesting one, and essentially, as Francis Young expresses it, there is not a single being called a fairy. There never was. Fairy initially referred to the land that they come from, or the state of being which is fairy, but it includes...
Thus, there could be a whole massive array of different creatures that are journeying over from
and it generally includes, just in the British Isles alone, there's all sorts, there's trolls and boggarts and trows and knuckers and eekors, and there's no shortage thing. Essentially, it's kind of... This is moving more towards sort of the Irish tradition, but it is kind of the other land, the other world, where all the weird things live and can come out. But at the same time, and this does not conflict with that, it also seems that fairies live underground as well, beneath us. So also that's underground. Also, this other land is also underground and can be travelled to through the earth. In the same way that people in the past have believed that barrows are passages to the land of the dead, which is another world, but which is also travelable through the earth.
Again, I love those because I mean, again, it's in. I guess I first came across it in the Greek myths, where people go to the underworld. You just go in a cave, and then eventually you find yourselves in this.
Most places, of the overlap between this idea of elfland or fairyland being the underworld. That's a thing. We'll explore this a lot more. We won't go into too much depth on this because this is explicitly
that poem,
episode 11. Orfeo is all about that.
I was thinking of the other one with. I'm
12,
not going to be able
to 12.
Yeah, I'm not going to come up with it now. No, I can't remember the name of the poem. The famous, it's Anglo-Saxon poem about crossing a river to find your... It was this guy's daughter dies and he crosses the river to... Never mind. Yeah, it's not ringing any bells for you.
Okay, cool. No, it's not ringing any bells. You sure Anglo-Saxon, not Middle English?
Might be Middle English.
Okay.
I remember it being very old, but it was in the that book.
Is it Pearl?
Pearl.
It's Pearl. Yeah, so
that's Middle English. Is it? Middle English.
It is beautiful. It's perhaps one of the most beautiful. No, it's definitely one of the most beautiful Middle English poems. I think it might be the most beautiful lyric poem of Middle English. I think. Yeah, well, with that, I happen to think that the greatest work of Middle English is Le Morte d'Arthur. I bloody love Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur. I think it's overwhelmingly beautiful.
But anyway, Pearl has that idea of it being the other side of this river is death.
Yeah,
doesn't it?
Yeah, it's lovely. Yeah. But yeah, again, we won't. I'll stop you there because
we'll come back to that in Orfeo.
Orfeo is so much about this thing of fairyland and elfland being the land of the dead. Like that's what it's about, and that's the great innovation that the English in Middle English make to the Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice is that for us the land of the dead is elfland,
the same as elfland
and
fairyland,
and it is the elven king who's gone to. That's the great change, and it's a very interesting one. I mean, the other changes
more on
to
that
happy
in episode 12.
More on that in episode 12. you've got that to look forward to.
I'll be here in no time, I'm sure.
No time. Actually, it won't be that long. Months.
I've been looking at the schedule for Finding Folklore, and we've got a lot of work to do, but it'll be done in.
When it's done, it will be done. I think it should come out
surprisingly soon.
I think the 1st of February is when it's scheduled to come out. I believe.
Yeah.
So stay tuned. So there's. So that's this notion of Faerie and of elves, but of all of them being lots of things that come out. Yeah. And it's in the aftermath of the Norman conquest that all these various different names kind of reduce to single names, and we end up with that for a while, and then very gradually, the names start to either redevelop or develop anew to help establish. I think partly because different localities favour different specific fairy beliefs.
Yeah, so that idea really supports your idea that it's nothing to do with the Anglo-Saxon.
With this Celtic fringe survival.
The Celtic fringe survival.
No, it isn't. I really don't.
That really kind of blows that out of the water.
I mean, really, I'd say I think this book is a really good. And so, in fact, if anyone is interested, I would suggest that the 3 best books to read, if you want to get your head around British fairy folklore, British fairy lore, I would suggest you read Catherine Briggs's Dictionary of Fairies.
That one looks really good to me.
Read this one first.
I like the size and shape of it and the cover.
Read this one first.
Looks like a good, useful book.
Read Francis Young's Twilight of the Godlings. And then read Diane Purkis's Troublesome Things, A History of Fairies and Fairy Stories. I think read this one last. I think this is especially fun because this is Diane Purkis.
Previous episode.
Of course, descended from Purkis, the charcoal burner who dragged the corpse of William Rufus to Winchester Cathedral on the back of his cart.
And welcome back to the matted hair of folk.
The matted hair of the folk, yes. Grand stuff. Yeah, I think this is a really good... This is a good book. It does a fairly good job of exploring the whole mess of what's there. I think in many ways it sort of comes between these 2 books, but I think it's best read after you've read Francis Young's, which all of these are great. I think that triptych of books will give you a really good understanding of just how little it's possible to understand about fairies and how. I mean, anyone who's familiar with Brian Froud's work, the artist. That's kind of pretty accurate in terms of the weird, just non-specific mad mess of everything.
How different they all are.
Yeah, that is what Fairy is. That's what fairies are. And Labyrinth again, the film Labyrinth, for which one of the musicians behind our theme tune, Martin Bridle, was a puppeteer many a moon ago.
Was he who was telling us that he...
It was one of the hands when she falls down the pit.
I think he was offered to stay on for a little while longer and operate one of the ears of Sir Didymus.
But he'd been in the studio for too long and he needed to get back out there.
He's a live performance kind of guy.
He wanted to get out doing the back on the Punch and Judy circuit, I believe. And who can blame him?
Yeah.
So that's a good grounding and a really solid introduction to fairies in general. The fairy lore of the New Forest area, as we discussed, and in fact, I will read to you. So that we covered the Colt Pixie sort of subtype there and the variants around that column. You will notice a lot of these words, even when they're put as different words, they're not really different words. They're just the same word or concept pronounced differently, probably just because it was recorded by a different person in a different place with a different regional dialect and accent. It's not really that simple. Certainly all the Colt Pixie, Colt Pixie, Cold Pixie, Coal Pixie, Coal Pixie, that's all the same thing.
And of course, before standardized spelling.
Yeah, and very much and before standardized, precisely. So that was the Coal Pixie, which obviously is a subtype of the sort of pixie proper. As we've established already, pixies or piskies, of course, in Cornwall, they're called Piskies, and then in Devon onwards, they're called Pixies, or they're also called Pigsies in some areas. The New Forest also often refer to them as Pigsies.
Pigsies.
And just as...
Maybe as you're saying with the...
Yeah, I mean, that's...
Pigsies.
Yeah. And again, it's so easy to get weirdly pedantic about this and start thinking that those are different things, but it's just different dialects and accents, really.
Yeah, isn't it that the sk and x sounds are often flipped?
Well, we often, people, it's not uncommon to get various regions where people say axe instead of ask today. So that's really commonplace. That isn't
That's the really famous one.
Yeah, that's the obvious one. But just as Colt Pixie or Colt Pixie is where we get Cole and Colin from, those pixies, we also, through Pixie itself, we get Puka and Puck. Or Pug, as we discussed in the podcast episode. Yeah. So there's loads of Puck folklore across the forest, across Hampshire, and there's, again, and so interestingly, Puck is far more widespread than Pixies themselves. And Puck, there are plausible derivations of the word Puck etymologically in many different languages, including both in Old English and in Irish. And so we actually don't know whether it's
like which direction.
We don't know which direction it comes from, whether it's Celtic or Germanic. We don't know, because
kind of cool
those words exist in both.
It's just
it may well be older. It may well be Indo-European, and so it predates the point at which Germanic and Celtic were separate things, or even were things in their own right. It's much, much, much older. So obviously, then you get. So I mentioned pixie-led being the term used for horses who in the morning you check on them, and instead of being rested, they're sweating. They've been active all night. I think in the Midlands that's called Puck-leden. So led by Puck. There's loads of similar examples. So again, this idea that
in fact we were talking about Harvey.
Yes, we were.
The last episode, and he's described as a puka.
He self-identifies as a puka, doesn't he? Yeah, Harvey. In case anyone is unfamiliar,
brilliant old film. James Stewart.
I think it was a play first, but
well, it is a brilliant film.
But the film
I don't care what it was first. It's a brilliant film.
It is a Jimmy Stewart film. Oh, it's really good.
And Harvey is was he 6'4" or something?
Harvey is a rabbit. QCC. He's a quasi-corporeal companion, an invisible rabbit. Yeah. We won't go into quasi-corporeal companions again. We've given them so. I don't think anyone who's
given them quite as much airtime as we have.
Yeah. I mention this. I'm back in Catherine Briggs' wonderful book. There is an interesting distinction in the general characters of some of the Piskies and Pixies. So Piskie, the name for the Cornish Piskies, is metaphysized in Somerset and Devon to Pixies or Pigsies, though they are on the whole very alike in character and habits. The Cornish Piskie, however, is older in age, not in terms of they are seen as old men, not as in it is an older myth or
not an older tradition.
No, it's not an older tradition. It's just they are more elderly. It is more wizened and meagre than the sturdy, earthy Pixies of Somerset and the white, slight, naked Pixies of Devon, which is interesting.
Yeah.
So in Devon, the Pixies are white and slight and naked, and sometimes quite, they have some kind of beauty to them.
Yeah.
In Cornwall, they're very elderly and wizened and strange, whereas in Somerset, they are sturdy. A bit sturdier. But interestingly, across, they really possess all those characteristics. It's just in different proportions.
Yeah.
All of them are, interestingly, Pixies are exclusively male in all of the traditional accounts. Exclusively male. I say that's interesting because the earliest Anglo-Saxon elf references.
Yes, this is in your Anglo-Saxon myths book, isn't it? The Elfland where they're all male,
all the elves are male.
Their society is having terrible trouble because of it.
So that fun. So that myth, which is it's over there. Blimey. Anglo-Saxon Myths, The Struggle for the Seven Kingdoms by Brice, Stratford.
It's a really lovely book. They're all very well written, but that one as a hardback kind of.
It's a very beautiful.
I like that's a book for display.
Published by Batsford. It's very beautiful, and I'm ever hopeful that Batsford will commission the two sequels I have researched. Volumes 2 and 3. Fingers crossed.
Maybe write to them.
Maybe write to
viewers
Batsford.
and demand.
Demand
more books by Brice Stratford.
Specifically those books. Anglo-Saxon Myths 2 and 3. So that myth in particular is a mythic expression of the theories observed by Alaric Hall in his book on Anglo-Saxon Elves. I think the book is just called Anglo-Saxon Elves by Alaric Hall. And in
that's a good name.
It's a very good name, isn't it? Alaric.
Where's that name from?
I think
it's
a Germanic name, obviously. It sounds Anglo-Saxon, doesn't it?
It does. It
sounds like it's Old English.
Because I was thinking about Anglo-Saxon when you're talking about elf becoming Alfred.
Yeah.
Elf council, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or something?
Yes,
there's a lot of names with Alf.
Yes, there are. Yeah, there used to be even more.
I can't think of any others.
Elfwine is an old name. That means elf friend.
Yeah.
And elf white or elf bright was a term of beauty.
Yeah.
Which isn't that lovely? Yeah. But anyway, we're off track.
Sorry.
Alaric Hall. Maybe he's Scandinavian. Maybe he's American. I don't know.
Yeah. But it's a good name, regardless.
Alaric Hall. So his book on Anglo-Saxon elves explores the degree to which originally they were exclusively male, and it's only in very much the later Anglo-Saxon period that they start gradually also female elves are introduced. Very much post the Christianizing era.
Yeah.
This potentially links somehow to the classic motif of elves or fairies kidnapping women, often in order to wife them, to copulate, to breed, to have their children. This motif and these various folklore elements, folk tale elements, I've then back projected onto Anglo-Saxon elves through the lens of Alaric Hall's theories, and that's how I constructed the particular myth in my Anglo-Saxon myths book. We'll deep dive that. The next video is going to be far more appropriate. So the next episode, episode 3, is the story of Sheaf and Shield, in which we talk specifically about Sheafa and Shuld. That's proper Anglo-Saxon legend.
It's a really good. You'll see.
You'll see. Wow. So we'll save that talk for then.
Yeah.
But how did we get onto that? What were we?
We're talking about the Pixies being also all male.
Yes. So that's interesting there, because that's a classic and actually very old idea that they're all male and that they want to take human earth women to reproduce with. And weirdly, we see that both in in sci-fi. We see that in alien stuff. Certainly in the 1950s, loads of sci-fi was about aliens coming to take Earth women to do things with them. We also see that in, and I do not subscribe to this theory, and I think Francis Young does a very good job of rejecting this theory. But there is this theory, not rejecting. What's the word?
Refuting.
Refuting. Yeah, refuting the theory. But there is this idea that that fairy mythology is memories of other races, other beings of humans, other species of human, such as Neanderthals or even older types, who would potentially come in bands and kidnap the women of your tribe. I mean, that is something that even within the modern human, in a tribal context, that's a classic thing which is done. The men are killed, the women and children are taken.
Absorbed into the other tribe.
Yeah, precisely. That's not at all unheard of. And so there is this idea that that's simply how Pixies and Elves behave because of that memory, that race memory.
But that is refuted in Twilight.
Well, I think much as we're back to the matted hair of the folk here, in that it makes sense. That is something that we see in warfare across time and place. So of course the idea that that a group of men would take women that's not crazy. That doesn't need to come from one specific thing. So I think that
could be.
Yeah, I think that semiotically that existing in the headspace of people, that seems obvious.
Yeah,
but
it makes it resonant when you put it in a story.
What Francis Young does is refute this direct
that is
derivation.
Yeah, it's a strict derivation.
Yeah, and I think he does. This is a really good book. This is a really good book. Twilight of the Godlings. It's a really good title too. Twilight of the Godlings.
Another theory that I think you told me. This is maybe a very silly, frivolous theory that you told me in the pub at one point. Is that as time went on, as history kind of progressed, as we got to people stopped believing in fairies, but at exactly the same pace they started believing in aliens.
Yeah, so I did tell you that. Yeah,
the little green men were continuous.
Well, I see this quite often. So way back when, fairies weren't small things.
Yeah.
Look at the Anglo-Saxon elves; they're tall, often taller than a man. Mm-hmm. And what I think is fun and interesting is that the more we get to know of the world, the smaller fairies become, until we get to the Elizabethan time when we've post the discovery of America, we've mapped the world, and so fairies have to be really little things. They have to be like the size of bugs.
The light of knowledge has increased, so, and the shadows in which the unknown hides have got very small.
Yeah, have got very small, because the only way they could exist, and we haven't really found them en masse, is if they're really little.
Yeah.
But then we start discovering germs and microscopic stuff, and at that point, fairies cease to exist.
Shoot up into the sky.
Then we get aliens. So then they start to come. And I feel like, to some degree, fairies are always one step beyond the place, one step beyond our understanding, one step beyond that which we have totally mapped.
Yeah.
Which I think is really fun. And in fact, as you say, little green men could quite easily describe fairies and could have been used 200 years ago to describe fairies, 400, 800 years ago even, to describe whatever they were referring to as Pixies. This green thing is the colour green and the colour white are consistently used with fairies. Consistently, weirdly.
Yeah. Well, I guess
even through back to the ancient Anglo-Saxon elves, specifically white, elf white, elf bright. They were very white, associated with the colour white, and then we get green used right again from the very early times, from the sub-Roman Britain stuff, green, which makes sense. It's this natural word, leaves and foliage and so on. Those two colours are associated with them throughout the that 1,000-year history, and continue to be associated with aliens, even though the
aliens
are the
get
thing.
grey as well. But
we still refer to little green men.
Yeah,
we don't refer to little grey men, even though we all consider a grey to be the archetypal alien. Yeah. We still refer to little green men. Still, if you look at popular depictions of the greys, they will still be given green skin, even though we know that isn't technically right.
It's not technically
even though we know greys don't have green skin. That's crazy.
Everyone knows that.
This is a cool element of fairy lore, and I think there's a lot of... I'm not the first person to recognise the overlap between aliens and fairies, obviously.
Of course.
I just really like the fact that you can chart them so directly. And in fact, I think Diane Purkis talks about this. I'll just check whether or not she... I'm pretty sure she talks about this in her book, Troublesome Things, which was published 2000, so before Uther had... fairy bubbles and alien abductions. She talks about this.
Okay, so it's a sort of a thing in the...
It's been recognised, or at least the connection with aliens has been recognised. It's just not something that's yet, I think, filtered down to the general public consciousness.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very appealing idea. Is that one that there's a smooth transition from one to the other.
Although that said, people do still see fairies. Belief in fairies, bizarrely, no, not bizarrely, that's not fair. Belief in fairies is one of the most prevalent supernatural beliefs in Britain. I say this on a lot of my talks. I say, and I've said before, I think on episode 1, pretty much everybody in Britain knows somebody who has seen a ghost or has seen one themselves. Almost everybody, if not everybody. Belief in ghosts is weirder to not believe in ghosts than it is to believe in ghosts, purely in terms of the numbers in this country.
Well, I mean, it's awfully tempting. When we were sitting down or just before we sat down to record the podcast discussion about Sprack Jack, all of my like computer hardware was malfunctioning, and then the milk turned.
Yeah, the milk turned. Literally, the milk turned. It
was still well in date. I tried to make some cups of tea, and it was a disaster.
The Fairies, it was the Pixies.
It really did feel like there was.
It was the Pixies. The Pixies. I tell you, it was
Robin
the Pixies.
Goodfellow was like pinching me.
We hadn't done well enough. We didn't. I hope. Well, hopefully, I mean, touch wood, nothing yet has happened during the video, so maybe they're actually quite happy with the chat we had.
Yeah, I think
afterwards they might not have been so happy with the story. But they were happy then with the chat.
I think they should have been happy with the story. We showed them in a good way.
I think it's a good, fun story. It's also interesting because it's a very different, tonally, it's so different to The Red King and the White Ship from the first episode. And again, the next story, Sheaf and Shield, totally different. The next story is far more mythic. It's far more, how would you term it?
Well, I was thinking of it when I will get to it when we get to it, but just briefly, when you performed Sheaf and Shield, it struck me almost like it was a spell or a ritual. It felt very... I mean, I guess it felt mythic is what it felt. And it felt like
very different to the other two.
Like something was being sort of summoned and conjured. It was great.
We won't go into too much because we've mentioned this before, but that's kind of one of the great motivations behind this podcast is that, and this whole wider Finding Folklore project is to really explore the breadth and diversity of the English tradition specifically, rather than misrepresenting the English tradition by placing it in contradistinction to other British or European traditions in and of itself.
So this idea of the fairies sort of kidnapping people, stealing away specifically women, that is essentially kind of happening in the story of Sprack Jack. This is, like she falls down the hill, but then she is taken by the fairies to the coronation, and Jack keeps seeing her in. She's always got gorse in her mouth and a ring about her neck, I think is the way that you...
Yeah, it's cool.
Because I was wanting to ask about that, but I didn't quite get around to it in the podcast section. So do you have anything to sort of add to the idea of gorse in her mouth and a ring about her neck?
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? I have no idea what that's all about. No,
it was it was in the story as you were told.
It was in the story as I was told it. I think I got... two people gave me the ring about her neck. One person gave me both the gorse and the ring, and then another 3 people gave me just the gorse. So I included the whole the combo because it seems pretty cool. Now I know that
it's so sort of vague in a way that I don't know. Like
it's fun because it seems to be referencing something that the original audience would have been very familiar with, or it's a remnant of something that once had a greater context to sit in, perhaps. I think that now I don't know whether this is there's this great Jonathan Strange and
Mr. Norrell.
In that really good, by the way. Everybody should read it.
Yeah, read
it's
the books.
Brilliant. But also there's a really good adaptation with Eddie Marsan.
I love Eddie Marsan.
Yeah, he's great. Yeah. He's wonderful. It's a really good BBC adaptation. Yeah. It's one of the very few examples of the BBC doing a really good adaptation in recent years.
Yeah.
They've gotten quite shoddy specifically in terms of adapting works in a way that prioritizes the authorial vision.
I'm not sure I've seen this. I should.
Have you not seen it?
I've read the books.
It's really good. Yeah. It's really good, and it's got the guy. So the guy who plays the Fairy King or the Elven King is what's his name? He was in I've seen it, of course. He was in a stage production of Cool Hand Luke that played in the West End. He was also he was in Hustle back in the day. Cool. I think his character was called Mickey Blue. When he was at drama school, he was in a relationship with a much older woman. These are facts I know about this man. Oh, he also played Mr. Tia Tame in again, really good adaptation of The Hogfather, Terry Pratchett's The Hogfather, which I really like that adaptation. Can't remember his name though, so that's not very much use. But he plays the Elven King, and in that, he does this thing of, I think, putting a rose on someone's lips to silence them.
Yes.
Now, I don't know. I don't know whether it's just from that or whether that's something which also appears and is a thing in the fairy lore.
Yeah.
If it is, then that might have some connection with the gorse. Gorse, for anyone who doesn't know, is a very spiky, thorny scrub plant.
Yeah,
shrub.
You would not want it in your mouth.
No, it'd be horrible. Very spiky and very tough.
I mean, I almost winced when Sprack Jack fell into a gorse bush.
Horrible.
To have gorse in your mouth. Yeah. Oof. Terrible. Fairy, a ring, a fairy ring neck, is mushrooms.
A fairy ring is a ring of mushrooms, yes.
But I don't think that's what it's referring to,
no, a ring around someone's neck could be, I mean, if you visualize that, it's like a necklace or what
chains,
are they called?
Irons.
What are they called though? What specifically? You've got manacles would be around your limbs. What would it be? A collar?
Yeah,
a metal collar about her neck.
Neckicles.
To do with neckicles. Right. Some kind of neckicles. A hedicle.
Because hand. Manacle.
Oh yeah, I suppose you're right.
Cap. Yeah. No. I'm
shackles.
Making up words. Yeah.
Regardless, so it could indicate.
Yeah.
So
she seems to be a prisoner essentially.
The thing about the neck could indicate her being a prisoner, and the thing about the mouth could indicate that she's been silenced.
Yeah.
Somehow. Gagged.
That she's
horribly.
somehow she's a captive in this situation. Yeah. She has been kidnapped. It feels like.
Yeah, it's really interesting this because you're quite right. We see the classic tropal motif of the fairies kidnapping a woman and specifically kidnapping her to marry her. So so that element really is there. Now, on top of that, we've already mentioned in the podcast the degree to which the Forget-Me-Not story is explicitly gender swapped in this New Forest version.
Yes.
And that is an element unique to the New Forest version of that story, whereby it's the woman who disappears and not the man who disappears. So that's quite interesting that we see it being quite an intentional thing that she becomes. And again, neither of those are my innovations in creating these. In creating this. In curating these stories, I've made a point of not introducing any of my own artistic innovations. Yeah. I've only included what was already there, what I already received from the oral tradition.
Yeah,
which is quite fun. Yeah,
maybe even I don't want to go like as we were saying, we don't want to go too much down the Orfeo route, but potentially there is something in common between this and Orfeo in that, she seems to die. Basically, she falls into a river and is swept away, which is death.
You're right.
And forget me not. Don't forget me as I am dying. And then she turns up, and his journey is to find her, and it's transposed into a comic vein.
You're
in
right.
This one.
That's really good. You're right. Brilliant work. That's completely right. And also, when they come back, they're born again from this well. They pop out of a well, pop out of a hole. She's naked when he had. I think an idea of why she's naked is that she was a hot coal, so it burned all her clothes off. But the phrase returned to lots of things. So that really is very much along those lines of him going to the other world, and as we've established, fairyland is a land of the dead. There was, certainly throughout the Middle Ages, it was very commonplace to see fairies as being somehow in control of the dead and the land of the dead. There is, in some corners, there's a superstition or a tradition that fairies themselves are the souls of unbaptized children or stillbirths. In others, that they're something else. The specific nature of fairies in medieval England, in true medieval England, was a source of some debate whether they were of God, of the devil, or somewhere in between. Which is quite interesting. But you're totally right. I hadn't actually looked at the plot of it as being what you described, which is quite literally she dies, so he goes to the underworld and brings her back from the dead. Yeah,
and
which is of course what he does.
Forgetting what he's doing along the way. I love that, and that actually works really well with your sort of episodic, picaresque. Sort of, I guess that amalgamation of the different stories, the different adventures of Sprack Jack.
That is a classic. That's a classic element of composite stories. Yeah. And again,
they link together with these little. They click together with. But what about your?
I was going to say. But I do not believe. I would say that they were already being presented as composite stories when they were told to me. Mm-hmm. I've simply combined the composite stories into a complete composite story. Which again, I know there's a lot of, some people feel very strongly against that sort of thing, but I am in that, and in a lot of the work I'm doing, I think it's easy to get confused. A key source of light for me, and in fact a great inspiration for Tolkien, was the Finnish epic, the Kalevala. Sorry to any Finns or Karelians if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly.
This is the Finnish sort of myth cycle. It's
the Finnish epic, although it's Finnish and Karelian. Karelia is an area which today sits, I believe, in both modern day Finland and modern day Russia, but it is deeply entwined a lot, as well as with the Finnish culture. This is the national epic, and it was sort of reconstructed is not the right way of putting it, but sort of restored, perhaps you could say, kind of creative restoration by Elias Lonrot. A wonderful name.
Another brilliant name.
Who I think he was just like a government health official.
You got to have a hobby.
Got to have a hobby. He was a young man. He was really young. I think he was in his 20s when he first set out and started collecting oral folklore around Finland, and he started to discover that the folklore he was getting, the songs, the poems, the stories, they all seemed to be fragments of some greater work. Isn't that cool?
That's exciting.
Yeah, it's exciting. So he then spends the next 30, 40 years traveling around and writing this down sort of and kind of
complete the picture.
Yeah, putting it all back together. I think the first... Wonderful. I think he published the first iteration of it was published in 1835, I want to say, 1835, or thereabouts. But there were other... He didn't then stop. He continued collecting and continued adding to and developing it. And I think his final publication was 1862. I think his final published, and there were multiple versions and developments within that time. Others began to translate it as well, and a lot of this was funded by the national government. There was a vested interest in refinding this Finnish cultural identity and cohering this Finnish cultural identity and Karelian, and this. The notion of a national epic is really a cornerstone for that. Yeah. Tolkien was really deeply impressed by and inspired by this work.
Of course. He loves that. Yeah, he loves that sort of thing. Yeah.
Totally. Right, famously. And I think that nobody would question the validity of the Kalevala as this national epic. Yeah.
It wasn't in any way wishful thinking.
Nobody would question it. And, well, frankly, if anyone... I mean, nobody would dare to, frankly. Nobody would question it, but people don't think to explore the same process of construction and development. This idea that across England, and Britain to a lesser degree, but especially across England, there are countless folk tales. I mean... these two massive volumes... A huge proportion of these stories are about a man named Jack.
Well, I did mention this in in the podcast very briefly is that like, you know, yeah, there are a bunch of Jacks, particularly in
loads of Jacks.
Loads of Jacks. Fairy tales.
Loads of Jacks. Jack, and of course, Jack is a common name in English. It's often short for John too, and so it can be like.
And can be a placeholder for just a guy.
Yeah, a guy, Jack. And in fact, I think
any old Jack.
I think Neil Gaiman,
Jack of all trades.
The Graveyard book. I think Neil Gaiman has all the Jacks as different characters.
I saw probably some sort of internet post nonsense where someone was suggesting. Actually in exactly this way of like saying, oh, this is this, that way that people like to do, particularly on the internet, of saying, did you know that actually all the Jacks from all the fairy tales are the same one? Like Jack Frost is the same as Jack and the Beanstalk.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely it doesn't make sense. Those two, specifically those examples, don't make sense.
Well, I did see a post that was trying to push that.
Well, the thing is, it's a fun one can approach it in that sense, because you could argue that that Jack as this concept of a sort of everyman figure, he, in that sense, conceptually, he is the same. All those different stories come from all different places. Yeah, a bloke does this. And so, of course, it makes sense that everyman then does all these things. Yeah. But yeah, the idea that it's some actual official thing, it's one of those daft things. But it is fun to thinking of it like that is in the same vein as the Kalevala. Taking all these different fragments as being something that can hang together as a cohesive whole. Yeah. It's also what has enabled something like Robin Hood to exist in such a great and cohered form now. The oldest stories of Robin Hood are tiny stories like that, and they have been combined sequentially into this larger composite tradition.
You have a character who is recognizable and kind of who the audience gets on board with, who is familiar to us, and then you put that character in different situations and have them go on different adventures. Yeah. This is I've been doing a lot of study on the Commedia dell'arte, and this is very much reminding me of some of the stuff that I read. It's what Allardyce Nicholl says about Harlequin. And he does it comparing Arlecchino to Hamlet, and saying that Hamlet is very specifically defined and does not exist outside of the context of the one play, whereas Arlecchino is extremely fluid at the edges, and he spreads in. We recognize the silhouette, we recognize some character traits, but we don't have a single line of dialogue that is Arlecchino. And I think people who talk about the Commedia dell'arte like to sort of own that stuff a little bit, but I think it's a good way of constructing story. And multiple stories, is that you put this figure, this recognizable figure with his green hat and his bow and arrow. You get, this is not Arlecchino, that's Robin Hood, in case you didn't know. But you get this character, and you kind of construct different stories for that person to live in. And this is the other thing about specifically the story of Sprack Jack, and the way that you've linked the sections together, is that it becomes modular. It becomes, you can tell this story multiple times, and each time you tell it, you can swap out sections and put them in different orders if you like. Yeah.
And I don't think that's my innovation either. I think that is that's simply how the story exists.
It's just a good way of doing things. I don't think it's almost too ubiquitous to belong to any tradition. I notice it also in Punch and Judy. With Punch and Judy, you have Mr. Punch, who's there all the time, and then each of the other characters will come in and do their scene, and then their scene off. And as such, each Punch and Judy show you see will have a lot of the same elements, but they'll be in different orders. You have a different scene with the Doctor or the Hangman. Yeah. They don't do the Hangman anymore, pretty much. Yeah, you don't do the Hangman. But the crocodile. Hopefully there will be the crocodile scene. You wouldn't want to miss that. But each of these scenes they begin and they end, and you could have any scene coming after that. You construct it in a modular way.
Yeah, and I think that's just the way that folk storytelling works, frankly. And I do. I mean, we won't go into the depths of Commedia in this video.
No, we might come back to it sometime.
But essentially, the followers of Commedia the whole field of Commedia is distorted by an extremely insular, inward-facing nationalist agenda within Italy from the 1950s, post-war. As a consequence, even to this day, the study of Commedia is predicated on ignoring everything that isn't Commedia and considering that everything that isn't Italian isn't Commedia.
Yeah, certainly. I would say that it's specifically like the study of it is heavily leaning towards drawing outlines around what is and what is not commedia.
But furthermore, I would say, so what you just said, that's like in Commedia, But Commedia is not the oldest of traditions.
No.
And a lot of what Commedia gurus will cite as saying, look, you can see Commedia's influence in everything later, and then they'll point at something which predates Commedia, and there's no reason that that the influence is from Commedia and not just from the much earlier thing. And I think certainly when it comes to this modular nature of semi-improvised character and story, that is simply how people tell stories.
How it was done.
That's the way that any familiar character...
How theatre was made. I think theatre, I don't know how correct this is, but there's a book a novel that I read at one point called Morality Play, about an acting troupe going around medieval England and performing morality plays, and each of the actors has their one speech that they do, or they have a sort of repertoire of speeches that they can roll out in any circumstance, and it'll fit into whichever particular play they're doing, and they chop and change, which is a way that they talk about being a feature of the Commedia dell'arte as well. And it just seems, but that if that is accurate to how morality plays were performed, that's the sort of the medieval English tradition. Pre-Renaissance.
Morality plays predate Commedia,
and I personally think that could well be like the other side of the parentage of Mr. Punch, especially in that he ends up fighting the devil in
the Vice character.
But I think that's really lovely in that. I mean, it's just a way that theatre works, is that you have your different actors who can kind of...
Interestingly, this isn't just something that Commedia dell'arte is guilty of. It is more guilty of it than most things, but certainly not so much now, but up until about 20, 30 years ago, a lot of scholarship around Shakespeare and Renaissance theatre saw it as kind of coming from scratch, starting from nothing. Since then, in the last 20, 30 years, a lot more, a far greater focus of scholarship has been in seeing the development from the medieval drama into the Renaissance drama. And in fact,
I think there's so much to say about that.
There is. I mean, this is another video because I realise we also haven't really explained what Commedia dell'arte is, and I don't think we need to really. It's fine. We've said all the stuff.
I don't think
we can move on back to Fairies.
Looking to go back into that, but
although it's not entirely unrelated, because of course Arlecchino and Harlequin and Harlequining, all this connects through the Wild Hunt to the fairy tradition.
I'm really looking forward to getting into that. I want to learn more about the potential connections with Arlecchino.
We will do a King folklore Hurler episode next season. Maybe that'd be fun, wouldn't it?
I want to hear that story. Frankly,
hardcore.
Just privately, you've got to tell me that story.
We go do a deep dive on the Wild Hunt. Would be really cool.
I'm fascinated.
All right, well, you've got a long time to wait, guys, because we've got we've got the first season planned. So season 2, we'll do Wild Hunt.
However, I think there is a little bit more to say about Shakespeare and his sort of place within a developing tradition.
Yeah.
I mean, so there is the one thing involving the Commedia is that people pay a lot of attention to how much Shakespeare is connected to Commedia, but then you get these figures like Falstaff who feel like they're coming much more from a an old.
Yeah, and again, also
they're a different archetype than you're likely to find.
And even then, there's a lot of distortion in its representation there in terms of connecting Shakespeare and stuff to commedia, because a lot of commedia is coming from the same archetypes that Shakespeare is also drawing from.
Yeah,
there certainly is some connection, but it isn't
direction
so,
of travel. You can't judge it so well.
But regardless, I think Puck is a key. Let's go back to Puck.
This is when we're talking about, if we start talking about fairies, particularly, so to move away briefly from Midsummer Night's Dream, Queen Mab is mentioned in the song that we had, the Fairies.
Yes, the lovely song.
Fran and Belinda. Mm-hmm. But then within that song and within various other songs that we've seen, and in the story that you told, we have a lot of stuff which is very you can see exactly the same details of
this is the
way the fairies
behave. The post-medieval notion of fairies does seem to
consistent
cohere around Shakespeare plays a huge role in this, the popularity of Midsummer Night's Dream, but he's not the progenitor of it.
That's what I think is so lovely about it, is that these are pre-existing sort of details, not even tropes, not even motifs. They're just like specific things that you say the fairies do.
In the Elizabethan times, a lot of this, so Spenser's The Fairy Queen, and again, it's wrong to say established because he didn't invent this stuff, but he kind of cohered a lot of these symbols and images and concepts and tropes in one place that was very famous. And that of course is relevant to Queen Elizabeth herself as part of this whole national project. But in particular, so a lot of these things we see are the song does a really good job of collecting them, of fairies slipping through keyholes in the night and going to lazy women. So in the song, there's the line, "While in sluttish sleep I lay," or something.
Great.
The modern ear means something slightly different. A slut, up until very recently, actually, for the most of the history of the word slut, it has meant a sort of lazy, good-for-nothing girl, a shammocking girl almost, rather than a
sluttish and
rather than a loose woman. So a slut would be sleeping all day, dozing, being lazy, rather than cleaning up and cooking and keeping a good household. Oh, sounds awful.
Terrible.
Oh no. So that was a major thing with a lot of fairy lore was quite domestic in its sense. So it would be punishing an untidy house or a messy household. You mentioned turning milk earlier. Well, that's if you're not actually keeping your household in good state.
Which
you're getting your milk in regularly. Well, are you? Because, I don't know, we'll see. The fairies have also been messing around with the cameras a little bit too.
You may have noticed that I have been looking at this camera, but we haven't been cutting to that camera. And it's because
you probably haven't noticed that. I doubt you noticed that.
I bet you did. Sorry, go on. But yes, so the fairies do things around the house. They turn your milk.
Generally speaking, there is this whole domestic component to them, which relates them to cough gods, cough goddess potentially, although very plausibly not actually. The idea of what cough goddess, household gods, is actually quite distinct. Household gods would be more sort of the family deities who would have an altar within your home to them. They would often be ancestral, and they would be prayed to. They wouldn't be something quite so small scale necessarily and diminutive as a household sprite.
Which
such
is
as Hob,
or who moves the chair as you're just about to sit down.
Exactly, that kind of thing. That's far more.
Which is almost on the scale of, as I was saying, for animism of like the chair itself decided to move, and you say.
A Type 4 QCC, you mean? Yes, potentially.
A radiator sprouting arms. Okay.
There's a lot more, so there is a lot more around that. As we see, all of this is there. There's also this idea of dancing in rings and of taking people away. And of course, there's the classic trope, which is what we see in Sprack Jack, of when you go to the fairyland, you are given this huge feast, all this food, all this drink. And if you drink any of the drink, if you eat any of the food, then you're stuck there forever. That's the last. So long as you don't touch it, as long as you actually eat it, you can still escape. Yeah. But the minute you've tasted the wine or consumed the elven bread, you're a goner. You are lost.
I'm not sure I quite registered that Jack was in that kind of peril.
That's why it's so. He's just before he notices the blue flowers, and then he goes, "Forget me not," and he remembers. And he goes, "Oh." Yeah. So he doesn't drink, but he holds on to the fairy goblet.
Great.
And interestingly, in the fairy goblet stories we also see the holding on to the fairy goblet is a detail from a fairy story in a Scottish fairy story. And I forget which, but some aristocratic family held on to their fairy goblet for many, many a year. It might even still be there, actually, the magical fairy goblet. I'm not sure off the top of my head.
That'd be great.
Yeah, so that, again, is a thing, a trope.
Yeah.
The idea of eating food or not eating food is one we see quite frequently. Who knows what that's to do with? But this idea that once you've eaten the food, you can't leave. Obviously, you could connect that to like the island of lotus eaters.
Yes. Well, I was thinking also this idea of when you grab onto them, they transform into various things. Where it's not. He doesn't really. He grabs onto the Colt, doesn't he? And the Colt sort of transforms into. So
the Colt, by the way, we're referencing Puck. The Colt is Puck in this story. It seems Puck turns into various things designed to scare him.
Yeah, I was saying this in the podcast, and again misquoting Shakespeare, but in Shakespeare he mentions a horse, a hound, a headless bear, a fire.
Yeah.
In that order, and then reverses the order. Lovely chiasmus going on. But anyway, but those all feature in your telling of the story.
Well, those aren't Shakespeare's innovations. No, they innovations. Are. That's standard. Those are just the things that Puck turns into.
And it's cool that's like a pre-existing list, which is Shakespeare takes wholesale.
We see that
and uses in his poetry.
Definitely postdates Shakespeare right up until even currently it
predates.
This exists. It predates and postdates. I said.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you should listen.
Sorry. Sometimes I get bored.
We see that. I mean, we talked about headless bears as their own cool, weird thing in the podcast, so we won't go over that ground again, I don't think. Yeah, really, really bizarre. A headless bear. It's possible that comes from maybe costumes. Bears, certainly in the Renaissance, would not have been unfamiliar in Britain.
Well, bear baiting.
They were long since extinct, of course. Yeah. But bear baiting was a very popular pastime in Elizabethan London. And
presumably before? I don't know when before.
Well, certainly it would have been invented then. So I don't know how much earlier, but so bears existed, and a dead bear could and was easily turned into a costume. If you got the costume and you just lose the head, then a headless bear costume, it would be a very easy thing to fashion and to make. Who knows whether that might be something in that. Yeah. Don't know, but it's a really cool, striking image which lasted for centuries in the public consciousness, and which is today sort of kept in aspic, preserved in this Puck folklore, this fairy folklore, this fairy lore.
But am I remembering right that there are things like that in like ancient Greek mythology as well, of you try and grab onto something and it transforms and transforms and transforms.
Again, this is a thing we see in loads. So much of fairy stuff, fairy lore in general, defies explanation, and it's so much more complex than this comes from this. It just doesn't. It just doesn't. It is. We come once again to the matted hair of the folk. The greasy, unwashed folk hair. All of this, it's like you've taken a skull filled with the thoughts and concepts and ideas of 3, 4, 5 different cultures over 6, 7, 8 different ages, and they've all been rattled around and shaken up, and then the skull's been cracked open, and you've just spludged it all down, and then that's just been guzzled up And that then is the story. That's fairies. You get all sorts of weird things.
Yeah.
You cannot say any one thing comes from any one other thing because it just doesn't. It's all related and all unrelated simultaneously. This wonderful span of grey rather than black or white is fairy lore.
A grand sprawling ether of ideas and images.
Grand sprawl. I like that. It is the grand sprawl. It is the soup of story, as Tolkien termed it, and that should be embraced. It is wrong-headed and misguided to try to
lock things down,
or to try to unravel them, and it's really naive.
Don't try and unravel the matted hair
of folk. Christ, what are you doing? But also, it's wrong-headed. Just because you can find some precursor to this one element, it doesn't mean that it's linear. It doesn't mean that it's the only precursor. It doesn't even mean that is the precursor, or even that it's a precursor. It could just be. It can very often simply be coincidence.
Yeah.
And that it doesn't mean that just because it's the earliest surviving example of it, it doesn't mean that that's the originator either. It'd be very weird. If the first example happened to survive. That would be, in fact, if anything, I would argue that the odds are against the earliest surviving thing being the progenitor.
Yeah.
Unless it's an exceptional circumstance.
Of course, because things get refined as they go along. And you have no idea where all the bifurcations are placed.
No. In the Great Sprawl, bifurcations are many. And the placing of them is hard to determine. Oh, fairies, they're great.
Yeah.
Puck, Puka, everything around this. Perhaps we should dwell a little bit more on Shakespeare. His A Midsummer Night's Dream is not the only example of fairies. Now, what Shakespeare did do with A Midsummer Night's Dream, which seems to be an innovation on his part, is he established what would become the Victorian flower fairy, essentially. With Peas Blossom and Cobweb and the little fairy servants of Titania.
Yeah, are they specifically described as being? Oh, yeah, because they the line in the song is, "In a cowslip bell I lie." Like they sleep inside flowers. They are
flower
explicitly
fairies,
small,
and they're described as these natural things. Now, so far as we can tell, that's Shakespeare's innovation, his creation. Those aren't based on pre-existing folklore, it seems. That is Shakespeare creating something, or
Tolkien,
if not Shakespeare, one of the, he'd be livid. He'd be livid. Well, that's one of the reasons
Tolkien likes his fairies big.
That's why I think he doesn't engage with those. In fact, few people do. But there's a direct line from those. Those are essentially not fairies so much as they are nature sprites, which again owes more to classical mythology than it does to anything folkloric in the British, Anglo-Saxon, or English.
Relating to nymphs and things.
Dryads, naiads, and such. But again, they're not quite that. Again, Twilight of the Godlings talks about this a lot. That then develops, that specific concept of the fairy is explicitly responsible for the much later Victorian flower fairy, which then became, for a good 100 years, what people thought of when they thought of fairies. This Tinkerbell-like creature, very pretty, with little butterfly wings, very small, and interestingly enough, for a long while, exclusively female.
Yes, the Tinkerbell archetype.
And what's interesting is that then this more aerial style, aerial as in The Tempest, not as in The Little Mermaid, this more aerial style creature with wings, this winged airy creature becomes the female, while the earthy gnome-like, pixie-like creatures remain male. That's quite interesting. We get this male and female divide in the so this modern age divide of genders across fairies actually reflects the much older traditions that they're built on. That's quite interesting. Again, there's no obvious reason for that, and there doesn't have to be an obvious reason. It doesn't have to necessarily mean anything will be pinned down, but it's certainly worth observing and recognizing. We then, of course, that Tinkerbell flower fairy, the sweet, lovely, romantic version, exists for quite a long time, and it's only really in very recent years. Well, it's only really since, I would say, the 70s that started to get pushed away from, and I think Brian Froud and the folk revival had a great deal to do with that. And then we had Jim Henson really working on that.
I feel like I had a book of Brian Froud illustrations at one point, and he did engage with that.
Oh, he did.
As well. He has
the best one is Lady Cottingley's book of pressed fairies.
Yes, no, that is the one.
Very
I had.
funny one. But so that's that one comes a bit later in his Genesis. But
it's very.
That's
funny
a very funny one. Essentially,
they're all squished between the pages.
It's like a book of pressed flowers, but they're pressed fairies, and so they're all crushed. It's quite funny. So he's well away. He's engaging with that, but he also has done. I mean, you must have come across them. Perhaps you've only seen that and his concept stuff for.
Yeah, I've seen the concept stuff for Labyrinth.
The concept stuff for Labyrinth and Dark Crystal and stuff like that.
Yeah.
All of that. The reason he was chosen as the concept artist for those
his previous work,
because of his previous work. Look into his previous work. He does. You
too.
Wonderful,
dear viewers.
You too. Look in Brian Froud. Brian Froud's great. Brilliant. He did a lot to help. So purely in a visual sense, he did a lot to capture people's imagination in terms of moving that away. Also, the 70s folk revival began to pull away from that Victorian refined, prissy version of folklore and folk culture, and to search for something deeper and earthier. So he went away from the ultra feminine, refined, winged flower fairy and back down to this earthy, salty, lumpy, weird, jaggedy, masculine fairy tradition of hobs, gnomes, pixies, dwarves, etc.
Yeah.
And interestingly, it's after, but we also have had, remember, from the Hobbit came out.
Yeah. 30s, Tolkien was.
But in the 50s we get the Lord of the Rings come out, and that really then pushes the high elf vision of so that brings us again this whole other fairy creature.
He really rejects the little winged fairy.
Oh, he certainly does. Yeah, Yes, he does. He does very much reject that. Well, I mean, it's not so much reject. Yeah. I think reject is right. He doesn't say this doesn't exist.
Doesn't engage with it.
He engages more with the old tradition. But really, what Tolkien is doing is going much further.
Where I remember some more little winged fairies, and it's in Labyrinth, where Hoggle is exterminating them.
Yes, that's fun. Yeah. Which actually, again, then being crushed brings it back to the Lady Cottingley's book of pressed fairies, or whatever it's called. He's got a little, treating them like little flies, So what Tolkien does is again very interesting, because he goes back way earlier, and in fact, early versions of his works, the hobbits were gnomes. And it's in fact worth commenting at this point that the word hobbit...
I think this is wonderful, this thing that you have about the word hobbit.
So what Tolkien himself... has said about this is that he invented the word hobbit.
Yes, because he says it was in a note that he wrote. Was it as
he says? I think
hobbit lived in a hobbit hole.
He was marking some papers or something, and he just apropos of nothing, a phrase came to him, which was the opening line. In a hole on the ground there lived a hobbit.
Yeah. Which he later suggested it was.
He later kind of engineered that, so the obviously
he thought it came to his mind because he knew the etymology, and it was a hole dweller.
It's not quite that he thought it came to his mind. It's more that he because obviously Tolkien was the great philologist, he thought of everything through the lens of etymology.
Yeah,
but I don't think it's so much that it came to his mind because of, but he kind of back engineered the etymology of it to be holbitler, which would mean hole builder, I think, or hole dweller, perhaps.
I think it was hole dweller.
Yeah, but bitler doesn't mean...
The impression I got when I read about it was that he was sort of under the impression that he had subconsciously developed the etymology at the time. The reason that the word hobbit came to him was because he had sort of subconsciously followed an etymological route to create it.
I think that
and then he later came back to it. Maybe making this up.
I think no, you're not making it up, but I think you've taken a very vague, amorphous process and made it incredibly specific and linear. I don't think that he suggested that it was as explicit as you're thinking there. But for him,
I imagine his mind was geared that way.
It was geared that, and as a consequence, there's no. Because it's so geared that way, there's not, for Tolkien, there wasn't much of a there wasn't really a causal line like that. Between which it's impossible to say which comes first. It's more just he's hyper aware of all these things simultaneously.
But regardless,
so the development.
His later thing was
he was a liar. He was a damn filthy liar.
But his later explanation was this
that was his permanent. He always explained it in those terms. However, as I say, he was a dirty liar. Who told a dirty lie.
You heard it here first.
So the Denham Tracts, a 19th century repository of folklore, so which certainly predates Tolkien's work on this by best part of 100 years. Includes at one point a list of lots of different words used for types of fairy. And amongst them is a hobbit. A hobbit. So there is no question whatsoever that the word hobbit has been a word used to mean a type of fairy consistently since beyond the 1800s.
But in that context, it's one in a list of words.
It's one in a list.
As there's nothing, no context.
It makes perfect sense because hob is another classic name for is a type of fairy, usually more domestic. And so where we get hobgoblin is the most obvious example of that. But it's the same thing. So hobbit. Of course that.
Well, I mean, hobgoblin. This is another thing that we talked about when we were working on Midsummer Night's Dream, is that there's this thing where first names are given to creatures. Hob being, was it a contraction of Robin?
Yes.
Hobgoblin. But that which also extends to birds.
It's actually with birds more than anything. A lovely thing about the English language is that up until relatively recently, all birds had full names. Now there only exist in a few of them. Magpie is magpie. Margaret Pie. Robin Redbreast is the full term there.
Who we call Ruddock, do we?
We call him Ruddock. But Jackdaw is another classic. They all had full names, which is beautiful. There are far more of those surviving than I know off the top of my head. But do look into them. That's a really lovely thing. But Hobgoblin is a great example of that. Robin Goodfellow is the same thing again. There's a lovely thing which you get across the world. A really good example of it you see a lot is in Native American myths and folk tales, where a type of animal will be personified as a character, fox. But what's quite nice is there's this underlying feeling that fox refers to both this character, but also this character as the archetype of all those animals.
All foxes.
Yeah, but also as all foxes. So every time you see a fox, you are seeing an avatar of fox, which is the concept of a fox. Like the thing that all foxes are an expression of is fox. And so every time you see fox, you are seeing fox, which is lovely. I love that. And
this is, I don't want to, I guess as a plug of personal books, my brother is a novelist.
Yes, plug away.
And, he used the sort of Reynard the Fox folklore as a basis for a series.
What's his name, Jim?
His name is Sam Thompson.
There we go. What's the book called?
The book is called Wolf's Tongue. The first one is, and then there are two more afterwards. Once you've done with that one.
What are they called? Not very good at plugging.
That's the thing. I have to remember the names off the top of my head.
Wow. Sorry, Sam.
The latest one is the Forest Yet to Come, and the second one, forget the name.
Brilliant.
Thanks for like putting
don't
me
blame don't blame me. Christ.
What is the second one called?
It doesn't matter. It'll be written down. It'll be written down on we'll put it in the comments. People can see.
Oh, the Fox's Tower.
Oh, of course, the Fox's Tower.
Wolf's Tongue, the Fox's Tower, and the Forest Yet to Come.
By Sam Thompson.
But he is interested in exactly this thing of like if you have. I mean, they do have actual names in his book and in the Reynard sort of stories. Reynard is the fox, Isengrim is the wolf. But they are representative somehow of all foxes.
A really good
wolves.
example of this as well is in the Brer Rabbit stories.
Mm-hmm.
Again, classic American folklore, which I grew up hearing those stories.
Mm-hmm.
Lovely. There's you see this across cultures in many different places, and I love it always because it's a really magical way of viewing and experiencing the world.
Yeah,
it's lovely to think.
It's when you see that rabbit.
Yeah,
you are seeing.
That's rabbit.
You are seeing the rabbit.
That's rabbit. I encourage all of our audience, all of our listeners, to go out in the world and try, just as a thought experiment, if nothing else. Just try living like that. Try everything you see. Every magpie is Margaret Pie. That's
I definitely actually feel that way about robins.
I do too now. It's once you start. Well, so in my Anglo-Saxon mythology book, there we have Robin Roddick features in one of the stories, and once you give character to these things, it's surprisingly easy to find that. It's a much better way to experience life.
Robins in particular is that you do see one, and they are territorial, so they come back. I heard recently they don't actually live that long, so when you see one the next year, it's not the same one, which is sad. But regardless, even when it's in different places, I just get the sort of instinctive feeling that it's the same robin.
That's good. There's nothing wrong with that. I like that. That's good.
It's
and again, Robin is a name. Robin Redbreast is one of the most obvious ones because Robin is a literal name.
Yeah.
Magpie.
It doesn't work quite so well with magpies because there's often many of them.
If you call them magpie, well, that's famously. There
will be a specific number of them, and you have to say the rhyme.
Mm-hmm. You know the rhyme.
Well, there are a few rhymes, aren't there?
Yeah, I like the older. I like 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, 4 for a boy, 5 for heaven, 6 for hell, 7 for the devil in his own true cell. That's what I like.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's a good one, isn't it? Yeah, I like that one.
But where were we going with this thought of...
I don't know.
Yeah.
Talking about animals, how cool it is that the world is seen in that way. Oh, yeah, and how that does transpose quite nicely onto the focus on Pixies. The idea of there being one or there being many. And interestingly, a lot of older stories about the devil, they're actually talking about a devil. This idea of the devil being Satan, the Lord of Hell. That's
sort of singular.
And of course, we all know that Satan and Beelzebub and Mephistopheles and so on are actually different devils.
They're all different ones.
Yeah, but regardless, this idea of the devil being the monarch of hell is relatively modern, and in a medieval context when people they refer to devils. It really just means demon or monster, and there are lots of different ones. So when the devil comes up and does this, that, or the other, it's a devil, but he's being spoken of as the devil in the same way you talk about fox or rabbit or robin or magpie. It's as if
I think maybe when I'm developing my Punch and Judy, I should sort of work on like having a take on that with my devil. Being sort of a devil, but sort of
a devil, but the devil because he is a personification.
I could even try and get Muller in there somewhere. The Muller.
Yeah, that would be cool. Get the Muller in.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. Bang. We'll see what I can do.
Yeah. Yeah. That's I like that. That's good. Good, hearty work. Yeah. And so there's a lot of interesting stuff there with Puck as well. Robin Goodfellow. People think of them as this is one character, but actually
this one creature that is turning everybody's milk.
Yes, and so people. And in fact, you could connect this with the whole Father Christmas thing. How people get weird about it and pedantic.
Did spring to mind.
So it's one person. How can one person do all this thing? Yeah. But this idea of there being one is
wrong-headed.
It's so wrong-headed. It's so modern. It's such a modern way to view things as well. Yeah. And that isn't how people thought. So you would say, "Oh, Puck's done this. Puck's done that. Puck's done whatever." But you wouldn't think for a moment that there was only one thing called Puck, and they only came to you.
Yeah.
Puck exists as multiple little pucks or Puxies, Puxies. Pixies, all over the place.
Yeah, there's a lot of people getting cramp in the night.
Yes, there are.
Being pinched by pixies.
There's a lot of ponies getting led too. Mm-hmm. This for some reason, it feels not dissimilar to this idea of authorship. Mm-hmm. In the modern view, an author is a single person, and a work is authorial, is written by a single mind. controls it.
Yeah.
The idea of the Renaissance idea of authorship, though, and certainly prior to that, the medieval idea, totally different. If you would rewrite something, and as you copied it down, it would be developed and changed by you. A play would not have had a single author. It would have been developed and different. A producer might well have employed other playwrights to create new scenes for it, and the scenes themselves would have been developed by things that were happening on stage. Really, it was only Ben Jonson who started cohering play scripts as single things. My great theory of it's so great. My theory around Shakespeare is that the reason
why Shakespeare is so good,
is because he was first and foremost an actor, and he had no issue with allowing the constant improvisations that happened on the fly during performances. The best things got cohered, they got script, and so the script was constantly developed in performance. And then when the first folio was published, it was compiled by the actors. So it was the best. It was constantly refined.
Part of your theory, in fact, on this, I think, is that because he was an actor, he stayed with the actors throughout.
Yeah.
Whereas another playwright might have, written a version, gone away,
whereas
come
Shakespeare
back,
was an actor and
a
sharer in the company. He was there throughout the whole thing. That's what makes Shakespeare's work. That's one of the things that makes Shakespeare's work so powerful and so good. And it's
rewriting,
it's a whole other thing. Shakespeare stuff,
collaboration,
ensemble work, really. And I think it's rather beautiful that the company themselves are the ones who
they were the ones who published, and
unlike it's the total polar opposite of Ben Jonson. Who oddly, actually, Shakespeare was an actor in some of Ben Jonson's plays. His name exists in a cast list for I forget which of Ben Jonson's works it was, but he did act in at least one of Jonson's plays.
I do like Jonson as well.
I like them all, Jim. They're all great. I'll take them. I will take any one of them over everyone we've got at the moment. In a heartbeat, there's no question. Give me Richard Brome over the entire output of the Royal Court for the last 30 years. Thank you very much. I will take that.
Okay.
Deal with that, Royal Court.
Well, you gotta step up their game.
They have. They're no Brome.
Yeah.
So going back to this idea, the reason I went on that weird derailed train of thought is that this is to establish this idea that one thing or many things, it's part of this very modern urge we have to categorize and delineate and control and specify.
It's very materialistic.
And quite egoistic, egocentric, thinking that you can control and understand and hold everything in your categories. Whereas the lovely mellifluous reality of Faerie across the board, but also of authorship or non-authorship in the older sense, and of animals and as a whole species,
that progresses into the world of a single mythic symbolism, which is
you have to
expansive.
Either you have to understand these two different modes of thought in this sense, or you have to simply reject the modern urge to categorize and understand and dominate through that understanding. If you really want to engage and truly understand and get into the minds that lived and breathed and operated on folk story, folk tale, and Faerie in particular. But that's what's going on here when Robin Goodfellow is spoken of. They don't believe there is literally a single being who does this, or at least if they do, then it's because their worldview. People would intentionally not be thinking. They wouldn't even have a worldview. They would have a village view for the most part.
Oh, yeah. Well,
if lucky, they might have a national view. They certainly would not have a world view. Conceiving of the world. And even then, people don't. People like to think we have a world view, but very, very, very few people truly understand the cultural perspectives of every different nation and people on the earth.
Oh, absolutely.
When they talk about the world.
But I think when you bring it down to that thing of how does Father Christmas do all the houses in the world in one night?
That's the perfect.
He could do every house in the village in a night, but even that would be hard work. But thinking of it in those terms, speaking of it in those terms is going down the wrong route.
Totally going, and obviously it's going down the wrong route. And again, we go back to this impulse that this horrible,
strange bean counting kind of
awful.
attitude.
I'm no fan. Yeah, it's very prevalent, and it's anti-fairy. It's antithetical to the pixie people.
Yeah.
So let's try and bring things. So let's try and get back. Let's try and bring things back onto back to Sprack Jack in particular, and let's look specifically at the story and go sequentially and make sure that we've kind of covered all the elements of the story in itself.
Yeah.
So once upon a time there was a lad named Jack.
Yep. Shammocking man. We all know what that means.
Well, I think we've covered Jack, the prevalence of Jacks across all sorts of stories.
Yeah, we've talked in the podcast particularly about dialect and these interesting words.
Yeah. That was more of a podcast conversation. We don't need to go over it again here.
No.
So do go listen to the podcast. Listen to the podcast.
The language is nice, is what it amounts to in my mind.
We've got the Forget-Me-Not story again. That's a common one. We spoke about that we mentioned it here. We spoke about it more in the podcast, and that is this idea that the New Forest specific version of the Forget-Me-Not story, which is a very widespread one, is what's recorded here, and that's nice to see.
I mentioned a bit of I guess this is to do with the different versions of Jack, but Jack and Jill and the tumbling down the hill, but we didn't find much of a thread to pursue with that, I find.
Then we have
the inversion of the Forget-Me-Not story. Did you just say that?
Yeah, I said that. But no, then we have this whole King of the Pixies, King of Cats.
I love
motif,
that. Yeah.
Which again we discussed in the podcast.
Yeah.
It runs back to his mother, which is all good fun. Oh, and then he ends up.
I do enjoy the way that his mother just takes it as fairly normal. Oh, I imagine that'll be Tiddy Cole.
Yeah, the character's great. So then he goes off and he sees him fly out, and he uses that to find the coronation. And they do the classic thing of, oh look, there's Pixies, chase after them. It gets there, they disappear.
Yeah.
Then they're over there. He gets lost that way. Now we'll talk about this more in a future episode, but that again is classic. You mentioned Will-o-the-Wisp.
Yes.
So the scientific term for this is ignis fatuus, which I think means foolish fire.
Foolish fire.
Or flame of fools.
Yeah.
And this is a scientific... so this is an actual phenomenon of weird lights that appear and then you chase after them.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, in a time when there were no electric street lights, this would have been far more prevalent. But also it seems that this is some kind of natural gases igniting and burning off.
Ignition of natural gas.
Which again...
from marshes.
In this country now, the vast bulk of marshland has been drained.
Yeah.
So you don't really get that issue much. But the New Forest is lucky to have a lot of wetlands. And this phenomenon does still occur here.
Yeah, so you get this folklore that springs up where it's essentially is telling you, if you see a light out off the path, don't go out there.
Yeah, essentially don't follow it because it'll lead you into who knows what.
Yeah.
Which is, again, really useful folklore. And I talk about this a lot. If you're just told not to do that, that probably won't stick with you as a lesson. If you
say,
this,
I'm told not to do it, I'm going to do it.
Yeah. If you get given this whole freaky story about what will happen if you do and where it goes, you are far more likely to not just get lost amongst the bogs in the middle of the night when you can't get out. And when that actually is quite a dangerous thing to do.
I would be discouraged by the idea of being told if you go out into the bogs you'll get sucked down into the bog and drown in horrible mud.
But you're
I'm a coward.
You're a coward. So we have that. We'll go. I won't explore this more at this stage, specifically because we will talk about this a lot when it comes to the Halloween episode. Because I go into great detail on this subject in...
This is episode 5,
Five, and beyond. I think 5, 6, and 7 are all kind of around the same Halloween theme.
Yeah,
so we will definitely cover
that for a few weeks. I'm particularly excited about this because these stories are going to be from... I think they're going to be from your new book.
The new book. The next book.
Which is Halloween folklore and ghost stories.
Yes,
by Brice Stratford, available for pre-order.
It will hopefully come out at the end of September. Hopefully, if not, it'll be in October. Hopefully, it will come out well ahead of Halloween itself. It'd be really annoying if it came out after Halloween.
Yeah, that would be bad.
But yeah, and I go into great detail about how these ignis fatuus, the will-o'-the-wisps, are a key origin of jack-o'-lanterns.
Yeah.
And I mean, I won't go into detail here further because there's some really matted folk hair there. But so we'll save that. But yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say that I'm particularly excited about these stories, not merely because they're from your Halloween book, but because that Halloween book hasn't come out yet, and I don't know these stories yet.
Yes, I see. Okay, it's cool.
So when we record them, it will be the first time that I hear them.
You've heard them. Oh, that's fun. Yes, that hadn't occurred to me. That is lovely. Yeah.
Which is, I'm excited.
So we've got that. Then we have the witches.
Yeah.
So then we've got the whole Puck thing.
Yeah, we have the Puck, the ragged colt first.
Ragged colt in this Colt Pixie form, and then Puck does all the changing. He's dragged out the bog, etc.
Pinches him.
He runs home to his mother. We've covered all this. Then we get the witches, Great Witch and Little Witch. We talk about this more in the podcast episode. I think we cover that, which is quite nice.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
That's great for I mean, again, if you haven't listened to the podcast, listen to the podcast.
You hear the whole story.
So then we have. He gets the fairy ointment in his eyes. Again, that's a classic motif, a classic plot point in the fairy stories.
That's a moment of seeing many fairies.
Yeah.
Where I don't know if it's just in my head, but they seem small.
Yes, they are in this. Yeah, they're all very small.
Maybe reduced in size.
I guess because there's so many of them. He then follows through the spine stone, through this cloven stone, and again that's an interesting one. This idea of traveling to fairyland in the earth, going into the earth. We see this again and again, and this relates to burial mounds, which is why it's interesting when the whole Tolkien coming up with the Hobbit and the Hobbit being a pre-existing thing. People say, but the Tolkien really developed what a Hobbit was. It was just a name. But the fact is, a Hobbit would have lived in a hole in the ground. That's because it was a fairy, and fairies live in the ground. They live in holes in the ground. They live in burial mounds. So actually, those elements, the fact that the fact he's barefoot,
whether or
standard.
Not, whether
most
or not
fairies would have been barefoot.
Whether or not that etymology of Holbita or whatever is that's regardless.
A hobbit,
it is. If a hobbit is a fairy, their fairies live in the ground.
If you talk about a hobbit being a type of weird pixie-ish creature, which is humanoid but squat, male, barefoot, lives in a mound. There's a hole, and he lives inside that mound. That is what hobbits always have been. That is the full-on folkloric hobbit. And Tolkien obviously refines those folkloric elements. And again, I'm not suggesting he actually intentionally did this and then kept it secret. But whether this is on instinct, or whether it's the magic of creation or subcreation rather, doesn't matter. This is what a hobbit is.
It fits.
You should feel free to talk of hobbits in a folkloric sense because they're a thing. Deal with that, big Tolkien. That is the industry. So actually, also, so long as you're not dumb about it, you cannot get in trouble for writing a book about a fantasy story about hobbits because that's not an invention.
It's not trademarked.
That's not trademarked. Well, it's not trademarked, and it's not a copyrighted invention of. You have to be careful, obviously. Yeah, but I
think people probably will feel like. Well, I think it does. Everyone who hears Hobbit will think of Tolkien.
Yeah, but I don't care. I don't care. So what?
But it's available.
But it's copyright free.
It has an older.
Ditto is Ent.
Yeah.
And a lot of these with these. Yeah, but regardless, that's a whole other thing. So we have all that. Then we have the coronation. A pixie coronation again is a classic trope. And with that, this idea of the fairy queen back from Spencer, this Elizabethan thing, we get this idea of the crowning of a fairy monarch is quite a prevalent image, certainly throughout the Renaissance. Then we finally have the thing of the drink, the food. Don't eat the fairy food, and actually we'll save this because I'm going to talk a lot more about that in I think episode 6, which is our souling, the origins of trick or treat.
Again, one that I haven't heard.
Yeah, this is so we'll save that. There's so much to talk about. Then we have the whole everything changing. Then they jumped, and again, so that the idea of the holding on to someone you're saving from fairyland, and they get turned into lots of different things. Finally, a red hot coal. So you jump into a well to put it out.
Yeah.
That exists. That is an existing motif that exists elsewhere in the British traditions. Then popping out and you meet the King of England. That's just a fun bit.
Is it just fun that he meets the King of England?
I think it's just fun.
The hunting party happens to be
it's weird,
that
isn't it?
of the King of England.
Well, I think that certainly this is a New Forest story, and so within the New Forest, as we established in the last episode,
because it's a royal hunting ground.
This is a royal hunting ground. So if you're going to see the king, it will be a part of a hunting party.
And if you're going to see a hunting party, it could well be the king's hunting party. And it has to be.
Yeah, it has to be. Or it has to be one of the king's guests. So even if the king isn't there himself, one of his mates will be. So it's not. Also in this, so within the context of the forest, it really makes sense. That really makes sense.
Hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, well,
very
that's
good.
what the chat's for.
Yeah.
So there's that. Then he goes home. He gets his eye poked out with a stick. Again, we spoke with this in the podcast. Classic trope.
Casually. That's
very.
So the other thing that's casually dropped in at the end is him being the seventh son of the seventh son.
Yeah.
This is out of nowhere. We learn that he's the seventh son of a seventh son and could perform cures.
Just thrown in.
Here's a thing you didn't know about Jack.
Yeah, he's the seventh son. So that was again. Now that's a ubiquitous thing, but that even so back to the earliest book on New Forest sort of folk culture. It's on the New Forest as a whole, but it talks about the folk culture. Is from 1862 by John Wise. It's called The New Forest: Its History and Scenery. There are earlier books, some from the 18th century, but that's the definitive one. Pretty much every book ever written about the New Forest since then owes more than half of its existence to that book by John Wise. It really is. It's also still very readable. It's a brilliant book. But in that, he talks about this belief that New Foresters have that the seventh son of a seventh son can do magical cures, has this magical ability. It's in the ubiquitous sense everyone knows now, just that they are magic somehow. But it's specifically this cure thing, which makes far more of a folk cunning man. A cunning man, a folk magician thing.
That seventh son of a seventh son thing, that's really ubiquitous, though.
Yes, it's ubiquitous. It is ubiquitous now, but 150 years ago, it would have been more regional. And
there are little changes.
There are subtle. Now, what's interesting as well,
their magic is the thing about.
What's more interesting in this context is that there was also a tradition that the eldest son was immune to fairies. So Puck has no power over the eldest son.
Yeah.
Well, the firstborn, actually. Sometimes the eldest son, sometimes it's the firstborn. But the fact that he is seventh son of a seventh son means that he's has no protections against.
He's extra vulnerable to.
Yeah, he's very much not eldest of anyone. Yeah.
I feel like there's a seventh son of the seventh son mentioned in the Storyteller at one point as well.
Oh, very probably. Might be the Luck Child.
The Luck Child, yeah.
Yeah, very, very, very probably. Oh, yeah. I mean, certainly within the last 100 years, say. The seventh son of a seventh son has been ubiquitous everywhere.
Spreads,
But it's one of those things that actually 200 years ago, it wasn't ubiquitous everywhere. It was in some regions, and it's one of those things that's been picked up and has since become known uniformly everywhere. Everybody is familiar with that, if nothing else.
Yeah.
Partly, I think, because of fantasy literature, and that's really helped it along. And it also mentions a couple of actual traditions of certain bogs in the New Forest, which actually do have supposed healing properties. Again, if you want to know the New Forest specific stuff, buy this wonderful book, Myths and Folklore of the New Forest. I'm never going to stop plugging these books, by the way. So get used to it.
It's enough.
I'm not going to stop.
No, it's not. I think it's rare enough that we can deal with it.
Good. I also, we're charming. Yeah. We're charming people. They're good books.
Yeah, they are good books.
So that covers the story, essentially.
I also thought just that there's a lovely little twist on the they all lived happily ever after in terms of the wording again.
Sprack and happy ever after.
Sprack and happy ever after, shammocking no more.
That's me. That's all me.
Yeah, and you can't say fairer than that.
Yeah, I'm happy with that. Especially as you can't say fairer than that. Again, it's a nice linguistic nod to Faerie. There are a few. Again, won't go into the details, but in the book, in the version of the story as written in this book, there are a few specific place names which I've kept in, which I haven't bothered mentioning here. Ragged Boys Hill, which I did mention, is a particular hill. There's also a specific place where Colin's grave is, Colin's barrow. Various others too, which they're all in the book if you're interested, really interested in the New Forest side of things. Or you can also catch me at one of my many endless talks that I do around the New Forest on the folklore. But for the general enthusiast in fairy lore, though those won't be too necessary. So I suppose I think that covers the story and the podcast as we've done it.
Yep.
We spoke in the podcast about the wonderful Fran and Belinda, who really are. I definitely want more from them in the future because they're
very interesting.
Philosophically, they are everything we're about. Really, in terms of their engagement with folk culture, folk music, and with their own place in it, their position has been one of continuity.
Yeah.
Oh, it's wonderful. And they do it so well. Big fan of them. And I really loved what they did with the song. Next song we've got is episode 3. Oh, that's the Shantymen. That's the Shantymen. So you've got that to look forward to in the next episode. Good proper shanty. Yeah, well, there's quite a lot to talk about with that song rather than this one.
So join us in the next episode.
Unless there's anything more. Can you think of anything more we should cover here? We've covered all those bits essentially. I've recommended all the relevant books.
I mean, if you have more thoughts about anything that we've spoken about, because if you've watched this whole video, then you must be an enthusiast.
You've got, or you're insane.
Yeah.
Or you fell asleep. There's that, I suppose.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, you could have.
But either way, you feel free to
do engage with us.
Contact us. Tell us what you think.
Tell us what you think. Tell us everything you hate about what we've said. Tell us everything you love. Ask for more.
Just
demand
things
less.
You noticed.
Yeah, just anything. We're really needy, desperate for approval. Tell us anything. The whole point of these long form videos is that we just engage with as much as we possibly can. We talk around, and we want this to exist up just as a resource.
Yeah, it's supposed to raise
anyone who's interested,
raise ideas.
Precisely.
Start conversations.
Yeah, start conversations rather than finishing them.
Yeah.
We want to provoke questions rather than provide answers, and hopefully we do more of the former than of the latter. Always. I really hope you've enjoyed this video and the previous video and this episode and the last episode
video.
And the next video, the next episode, and all the ones we have in the future. I think that's all from us now.
That is all from us.
I hope to see you next time.
Please like, subscribe, share, hit the bell, etc.
And good luck, as ever, in finding folklore.
Bye.
Bye.